The webinar is about to begin. Please stand by.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar by the Change Institute. The webinar is on the significance of resilience of leaders for successful change management. We're thrilled to have you join us as we investigate the critical role resilience plays in navigating the ever-changing landscapes of contemporary organizations and economic settings. Change is unavoidably in today's fast-paced and highly competitive business climate. Leaders who can successfully adapt to and manage change are critical to an organization's growth and success. Resilience is a crucial characteristic that distinguishes successful leaders, the ability to recover quickly from setbacks, retain a positive outlook, and keep moving forward in the face of adversity. We're happy to welcome Jo Twiselton as today's speaker. She is the founder of Twist Consultants. Throughout the years, she has given advice and assisted leaders and organizations in their efforts to succeed at change. Last week, Jo was in Vienna to record a couple of sessions and lessons for our new change management executive education program. So it's a pleasure to having her today share some additional insights with all of us. Without further ado, please welcome our speaker to the live stage.
Thank you, Chris. And it's great to be here with you. So I'm going to spend about the next 40 minutes talking through some ideas, thoughts and perspectives on this topic. And I'm going to walk through a slide deck with you. It's going to be an interactive session. We won't be chatting so much, but what I'd really like to do is ask you throughout. You'll see some pauses in the slides as we go through, where I'd like you just to take a few seconds to think about the question and maybe to take some notes for yourselves. So there are opportunities for questions at the end. I'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback and ideas on all this. I'm always really keen to hear everybody's learning and experience in this area, and you'll hear me say this through today's session. None of us have all the answers right now. So just by sharing and collaborating on what we're all learning can be really valuable for each of us. So ask questions, comment today, and do feel free to connect afterwards. Before we get started, and I'm just going to reflect on a couple of things that Christopher said earlier, and just to touch on what I'm hearing and seeing in change right now. It's quite volatile is probably the word, or turbulence, another one that's quite good at the moment. As well as what's happening in our work lives, we've got a complete backdrop of other concerns that are happening. And I probably don't even need to mention this to you all, but I'm going to for the sake of context. As we continue to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic, we've got a lot of big global stuff going on. So we've got a war, which created instability in a number of ways. So supply chains, political instability, and influenced cost of living crisis, which we're all feeling at the moment. We're continuing to see the impacts of climate change starting to bite. And alongside that, we're seeing greater and more ramp up of technology. Most recently, in the last couple of days, there's been debates about whether there's a pause on AI. Specifically, I think that's been around ChatGPT. So there's been a lot going on, and the words resilience and well-being, which I'm not going to cover in too much detail today, those two words have been used a lot in the last 3 years. And when I talk about this topic with people, I sometimes get a sort of wearied response, but I do feel that there's some real power behind those words and some really useful things that we can learn, put into action, and that can be really helpful for us as leaders, but also for supporting our teams in what's really noisy and unpredictable time right now. So one caveat I'd like to just add is that sometimes even just thinking, talking, listening about this topic can provoke some mixed emotions. So if you feel that you need support or you want a conversation about this with somebody, then I would encourage and urge you to do that too. The other element that I'm going to add here, and I will say this throughout today, it's not about adding things to your to-do list. our workloads are quite sufficiently filled at the moment that we don't need more things to be doing on top of everything else that we've got. So this is about learning things, staying curious, testing things out, and not overwhelming yourself with stuff to do. It's a place just for the next few minutes to think about this and then consider things that you might want to take forward for yourself. And it's definitely not about being perfect either. So moving on to the next slide, why me and why this topic? So in a nutshell, I work with organizations, leaders, and teams, and it's all about keeping disruption, uncertainty, and anxiety that can happen around change to a minimum. And that means that change can be sustainable, people-focused, and healthy. Sometimes change is really not a positive, but it's about helping people work through it in a place that they feel that they've had a more positive experience than a negative one by the time they get to the other end of it. And that's particularly in planned change. A lot of my work involves using coaching, communication, facilitation, and well-being approaches and resilience. And that's to help leaders, teams steer through transition, transformation, or the constant perpetual drumbeat of emergent change that we're all facing at the moment. So as it says on the slide, I've spent the last 20 years through my consultancy at Twist, working with different organizations in a whole range of sectors. But it's all about helping leaders, teams, and the people in the organizations work proactively and positively and constructively with their responses to what's going on around them. And when that happens, I've seen that there's a better contribution that people can make and generally a better atmosphere as well inside the organization. And that has a ripple effect across teams. So a mentor once told me a long time ago that it isn't organizations that change, it's the people inside them, and they change one by one by one. So they do that one at a time. So that's why my focus is so much on the people part of change and has been, less so than the processes and systems. Now, my own experiences formed quite a big part of this. So in the very early days of my career, which was quite a while ago, but unfortunately, I still see some of this behaviour now, I equated working long hours with getting ahead. So they were the role models that I had. In the long run, that didn't serve me or the teams that I was leading particularly well, and especially when we were working on things which weren't badged as change at the time, but they would definitely be that today. So things like launching new products, launching a new organization, creating a brand for that, a merger and an acquisition. So I had very sustained levels of stress that I was trying to maintain. I was finding some of it a little bit compromising for my values, which I didn't recognize at the time either. And there were a lot of conflicting priorities. And at the same time, I was learning how to do a job, how to manage a team. My resilience was impacted by my own responses to that. And that showed up in lots of different ways. So I started getting sick. I was signed off work for a couple of weeks. So it wasn't a great example, but what that did do for me was got me really interested in our responses to change as individuals inside organizations. I did more work in this space. I saw more of the impacts on individuals that had been not necessarily the same response and outcome as mine, but responses nevertheless on their well-being and resilience. So I studied stress in the workplace. I qualified as a coach, an executive coach. I qualified as a well-being coach. And I'm also a practitioner of a psychometric called RAW, which is workplace resilience and well-being. And I now also work in the sphere of climate change, again, looking at the emotional response to this and how we can get people into action. So that's all about me and why I do this. But it's worth underpinning that we're still not where we were dealing with start and end projects, so a lot of change management is focused on that, we're also having to navigate that continual backdrop. And because our working lives have changed so much in the last 3 years, a client of mine last year used the term life balance rather than work-life balance. And you don't hear me talk about work-life balance at all. It is literally about how we're balancing our lives as a whole. So before we get started, I would like you to just spend a couple of minutes, you can write it in the comments if you like, to just share why you signed up for today's event. I'm interested to understand, maybe you're curious about this topic for you or your team or your organization, or maybe how you can help your clients. Or maybe you don't know, you just thought it sounded interesting. So that would be really helpful, just to set the scene for yourself as much, to understand what you want to get out of the next few minutes that we're going to be together. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about that. And then what we're going to cover today. So Christopher covered this and you will have seen it in the run up to today's session. So we're going to talk about resilience. I'm not going to spend a lot of time today talking about some tools, things like how to eat better, sleep better. That's for a different time. That they are important, but I'm going to explore instead why I think resilience is important for leaders in times of change, building on what Christopher said in the introduction, things that might get in the way, and then some tools that might support your toolkit as a leader in developing resilience. There's a lot of research around this topic at the moment, so I'm going to share some of the approaches around that. Some things I've learned from my own experience and from others too. I'm also conscious you may have heard some of this before, and I'm not going to apologize for that. So what will make the difference is hearing it and perhaps bearing it in mind and doing something about it too, and taking action. So I know that everybody here is different. You're in different contexts, different situations, environments. So what I've covering is really designed to apply to all those different circumstances and backgrounds. And before we move on, I will say that I firmly believe that our resilience and well-being can be grown and developed, and that's why we're talking about it today. Little things every day, building new habits that can make changes over time. And again, not just for us, but for the people around us. So if you've heard or read the book Atomic Habits by the author James Clear, he mentions in there that forming a new habit can take up to 66 days, so nearly 2 months. So again, as I mentioned earlier, this isn't about layering lots of actions and new habits on top of another. This is about taking sustained action and using those 66 days on one thing at a time. So let's look at resilience. What does it mean? How does it feel to feel resilient? The term that I see most often used, and again, I'd love to get your feedback on this, is bounce back. So it turns up quite often. And for me, that implies that whatever life throws at us, we're bouncing back to the same place that we were. But resilience can be quite complex. It depends on different things. It can mean different things to different people, and it depends on the context or environment that we're in. It can mean different things to different organizations, to different people. So it's slightly more rounded than that. So I wanted to offer a couple of different approaches today to this idea of resilience. So I'm going to present you with 2 quotes. So the first one is from Mind, which is a mental health charity in England and Wales. And as you'll see from this quote, not just your ability to bounce back, but it's also your capacity to adapt in the face of challenging circumstances while maintaining a stable mental well-being. So it's about adaptability. It's learning from what's happened and being able to keep some stability at the same time, as well as moving forward. So that's the first one that I wanted to share. The second one is from a book called Stop, Ask, Explore by Professor Joan P. Ball. And she's building on the work of someone called Dr. Michael Unger. It's a really interesting read. And she talks about resilience as being something more active. So it's about us having agency. So I'll read this quote out for you. Focuses less on resilience as a trait or a passive act of waiting to bounce back, more on the agency that we have to pursue resources or seek assistance finding them. And as a result, we have something to focus on when we don't know what to do. So when we get kind of hit by challenges, this is about taking the focus away from the threat and uncertainty and instead looking at the art of the possible. So feeling that you have skills to adapt to difficult situations, you can understand your own emotional responses, and you can really, what she calls, engage in dispassionate curiosity to understand what's going to work for you, what resources you might need and how to find them. So a slightly different perspective from the bounce back. So that's really what I wanted to cover with that. And this is a topic that we could talk about a lot. And as I said, it's developing quite a lot at the moment. So, excuse me. I'm now going to look at why resilience matters for leaders in times of change and my perspective on that. Change is pretty much all the time now for leaders and has been for some time. But as a leader, your people will be looking to you for answers. And that leads us to three things of why I think it's important. So people will look at you for answers, particularly about the why things are changing. If it's a plan change, for example, why are we doing this? Why does it matter to me? What's in it for me? All those sorts of questions to have answers to. But they'll also be looking for you to steer and navigate them through whatever that transition or transformation might be. It means clarity, giving them a narrative, ideally, about why change is happening, a framework, a structure, a plan, a drumbeat to walk through when and what is happening. And it's really giving them that context and certainty when there is very little. And they're looking for people and they're looking at leaders for confidence in the way ahead. You might not have all the answers, but equally, it's okay to tell people that you don't have all the answers, but to be able to come back to them and give them some certainty of when you're going to come back to them to do that. The second reason that I think it's important is the bumps in the road. And we've seen this a lot in the last few years. Things at the moment are rarely going to plan, and especially right now. So the adaptability piece that we talked about earlier, and that piece that I talked about with the two quotes around resilience, that ability to adapt to challenge quickly is key, and to be able to regain that level of equilibrium. And the third area, and the third reason why I think it's important, is around people. And two particular aspects here: emotional intelligence and empathy. Having good emotional intelligence as a leader, so understanding our personal responses to change and situations, and understanding what that means for people around us, is key. It means we're in a better situation to show greater empathy for others, and that means we listen better and we respond better, we ask better questions appropriately to whatever might be suitable. One phrase I learned many years ago is that quite often people just need a really good listening to. And that's really important in times of change. And it's a source of so much information. Staying curious in change and asking questions and really listening hard can really help you build your bank of knowledge about what's going on. So let's look at what gets in the way, what impacts resilience. There are several things that I've got on my list here. So 4 things. We'll start with emotions. This is where our reaction to what's happening around us can kick in. Our brains work in a particular way. Evolutionary standard for us in our brains have not caught up as quickly as the world around us has changed. So we are still responding to things that change in our horizon as a threat. And that could be as simple as having a reboot on your IT system at work, which then knocks your computer offline because it doesn't work properly. Your brain perceives that as a threat. It will create a level of anxiety, however high or low that may be. We are responding to things like that in the same way that we used to thousands of years ago. So being aware that that is the situation means that that can spark emotion in us. So having greater clarity about how we respond to situations and being able to recognize and just taking a pause and thinking, okay, I'm getting worried now because this isn't working, but that's the emotional response that we're having, can really help us keep that to a minimum. And that's that emotional intelligence piece that I talked about as well. Attitudes to change, really interesting. So quite often, when somebody announces that they're going to make a change in an organization, when a leader stands up and talks about the change that's coming, people are not that positive about it because of that fear and uncertainty piece. So as leaders, it's important for us as well to have a shift in our own attitudes to change, because we can feel that too. You've already got a massive workload. So adding something onto that by asking people to roll out a new training program or give a briefing to your team or introduce some sort of change can just feel like that layering of workload on it. But reframing it and rethinking it, which takes practice, and shifting our perspective to something more positive can be really helpful. And that, again, that will trickle down to your team. So as well as a threat response in our brains like reward too. They release different hormones, threat and reward. But if we can optimize that reward aspect of change through your perspective of how you deliver that and how you perceive that change, you'll be communicating it in a more positive way too. So some of this is how we are able to make the space to shift our attitudes to change and not see it as a negative. Hope and optimism. I could talk about these two things for a very long time too, but there's a lot to cover here. But hope is, there's a lot more science around hope than you might think. There's a lot of work been done in this area, and it's constructed around three main attributes when you start to scratch the surface. So starts with goals and vision. So something that you want to hope for. The second thing is agency, and that's the motivation that really drives us forward to reach our goals. And then for me, the third and probably the most important is pathways. So it doesn't become just aspirational. Pathways is the plan that we have to get somewhere. So it's a much more active approach than we might think. So it can help to sort of flip negative energy in a way into something much more positive that can help us move forward. So, and with that lens, you can also think of things in a slightly more positive way. And optimism is promoted by hope. It's not being overly positive, but in a leadership context, it can perhaps be more about not looking just at the short term, but beyond that. How do we get out of this? And looking beyond the challenge that we have on in our immediate gaze. So these are both for me about positive action, about moving forward. And finally, of the four things that I think impacts resilience in a positive way is coaching. Either one-to-one or in teams, it's an opportunity for leaders, teams to explore opportunities or solutions that could work for them. It's not about them being advised, that's consultancy, but it's about giving people the space to work through their own ideas and thoughts and having a safe space to do that. So in this context, as a coach, I've worked with leaders, for example, who've been keen to have a space to work through something that they can't talk to their team about, or perhaps they're dealing with their own challenges about the change that they're facing, and they want to be in a positive space to take that forward. So there's a variety of different ways that coaching can really help to impact resilience in a positive way. So those are the 4 impacts. And I'm now going to talk about and run through leadership resilience toolkits. So everything that you've heard already, I'd just like you again to pause, maybe add something in the comments if you want to, about what you think you already have in your resilience toolkit. Multiple tools work for different people. There's different approaches, different contexts, different environments, and there's no magic pill. So what do you think you've already got? Great, I'll give you another couple of seconds. So again, I'll repeat this again. It's not about adding more workload. It's about finding what works for you and about not creating pressure. So we all are fairly resilient. We can develop it. We've got this far. And again, this is about adding small changes if that's appropriate. If you'd like to explore this further, there are tons of resources available around this. There are books, podcasts, webinars, you name it, and websites. So if you do want further resources to explore some of these things in a bit more detail, drop me a note or connect with me afterwards. Very happy to share those. So I'm just going to look at a few toolkit ideas for you. And we literally just talked about attitudes to change and things that might hinder our resilience. So here's 3 things that I wanted to talk about and explore in a little bit more detail around attitudes and what we can do to support those in a more positive way. So first of all, track and note. If you do any work with me or you read things that I share, you'll often hear me talk about the power of reflection and writing things down. I talk about it a lot. I'll give you an example of trying to make sense of things. Really, for me, that's why it's so important. In 2020, there was some research carried out that showed that we have over 6,000 thoughts every day. I haven't got as far in the research of finding out whether they're positive or negative. I was slightly concerned that the number of 6,000 was quite overwhelming as it was. That's a lot of thinking. And it might explain why sometimes we feel a little bit stressed at times. So writing things down for me, so tracking things, notes, keeping just a few notes now and again, or even dictating it into your phone, can help you make sense of things, give you a bit of clarity, give you some different perspectives. It will help you spot patterns. It will help you spot words that you're using yourself. And it also helps to take notice. So pausing, reflecting, taking notice is one of the 5 ways of well-being that we have in the UK as well. So not just things that are going on around us, but what's happening in our heads as well. Which brings me nicely on to self-talk. And we're probably all quite familiar with this. So for me, and there's again a lot of research around this, and on my resources list, there's I refer to a book called Chatter by Dr. Ethan Kross, which is all about that self-talk and that chatter in our minds. And what I found is when we get busy or we get stressed, our self-talk can get quite busy too, and it can get a little bit negative. So we spend a lot of our day in our heads. So to try to address some of that negative self-talk, saying things out loud, talking to other people, can really help us think differently, get us into a different mindset. So Chatter is a great book, actually, and it will sometimes when you think that you could really do without the chatter in your head, he gives a fabulous example of a lady whose inner voice disappeared and the impact of that. So highly recommended read. The final one is imagining. And I'm going to talk about this from a context of those of you who've led or worked in change projects. You may have carried out a pre-mortem where you look right to the end of the programme, and it's kind of like a lessons learned in reverse. So you're doing the lessons learned before you begin the programme. You're looking at your end goal. You start with the end in mind and you work backwards of the things that could trip you up, things that you hadn't considered, or things you might want to do differently. And for me, imagining is a little bit like a pre-mortem. It's thinking about how you're going to do things, getting your mind trained to think of a way through in a positive way of going through an activity or an idea or a project. So it's really using that part of our brain that helps us imagine and focus on how things will look in the end and steps that we can take to get where we want to get to. Another tool you may be familiar with is the circles of influence and control. And this is adapted from Stephen Covey. You may be familiar with this, but I'm going to share an exercise with you around this. So this is also helpful to use for teams too. So in the outside circle, you'll see concern. And I like to use Post-it notes. So on an individual Post-it note, write down a concern that I might have. Put those in the circle. Then think, out of all of those concerns, I move the Post-it note to the influence circle. If I think I can have some influence on it, I may not have the authority to influence it, but I may be able to have an influence. So they get moved to the circle, the next layer in. And then there are some things which you can have direct control over, and they can move to your circle of control. Because sometimes this is a really useful exercise to do at an individual and team level when things can feel a little bit overwhelming and we don't have influence on. And also, as leaders, it's worth noting that the influence circle I've found is that leaders and managers can often have indirect influence without authority in organizations, and that could be really valuable for the rest of your team. The final thing, so the things that you'll see around the edge, is when we feel that we have no control over anything, when sometimes things get very overwhelming, there is always something that we can do that can stay within our own realm of control. So what I read or watch, how I treat others, or what I notice are just a few examples that I wanted to add on. Another tool that I introduced for you, which I think is really useful from a resilience perspective, is understanding motivators. So this is SPACES, stands for, as you can see on the left-hand side, self-esteem, purpose, autonomy, certainty, equity, and social connection. And this is in a book called Neuroscience for Organizational Change by Hilary Scarlett. And it's all about the factors that can impact our individual motivation and employee engagement. So when we have all these factors, our brains are in a reward state. So remember that positive reward releases positive hormones. When we're in a reward state, we're more likely to collaborate. We feel more resilient. We feel more positive. We're more focused, and we're generally in a good place. If we don't have all these elements in our lives or in our work life particularly, we can get into a threat state. So anxiety can start to build up. We can feel the shock, concern, uncertainty. We can think less clearly. I quite often see tunnel vision coming in where there is no opportunity to think about different options and limited flexibility. And we have less emotional control. And there's a long list we can add here. So as leaders, there are lots of ways for us to use this model to both understand our own motivations and what's important to us, and also for your teams. So if we take self-esteem at the top, for example, if you're going through some sort of planned change, how could you think about helping your people maintain and develop their self-esteem through that change. It could be something as straightforward as continuously reporting on the progress that you're making in the change, how you're hitting milestones, celebrating areas or points in your plan where you've succeeded. That sense of achievement could be really important. So that's an interesting model. I'm going to tackle a couple of elements that I feel are really useful from an individual resilience perspective for leaders too. And these are things for you to think about for yourself very specifically. And this is energy. There's been a lot of focus over the last few years around productivity and time management, and the volume really went up on this when we went into working from home during the pandemic, as how can I be more productive? I've run sessions on both time management and productivity before, but what we're really aiming for is energy management. So again, there's a self-awareness piece here about what's a motivator for me around energy and how do I operate optimally to get the best energy. What's the best time of day for me to work? How do you do your best work? How do you get focused? Do you know what foods make you energized or what puts you in a slump? So for me, it's bread puts me in a slump. How do you stay hydrated? Can you tell the difference when you're hydrated and when you're not? Can you pace yourself? Can you get regular breaks? Just understanding what gives or saps your energy can be really helpful in a leadership role. There's another analogy of buckets, and we have mental health first aiders in the UK, and I know that they exist in many other countries too. I'm a mental health first aider, and they use an analogy about stress containers. So how can you use a container to visualize how full your container is with stress? So I use a bucket for mine. So when my bucket is too full and it tips over, my stress levels get too high, my responses to what's going on can tend to be a little bit more unhealthy. So that looks like I stay at my desk too long. I eat more chocolate. In the medium term, it means I don't seem to have time to talk to friends more often or go out. I'm just too busy to go for a walk. So having that mental bucket has been really helpful for me. One of the things that, if you work with me, you will hear me talk about a lot is questions and using our ears a bit more. And I referred to this earlier. Listening, actively listening. So listening and being curious, not listening with the intention to speak, but to really understand what's going on. I know it can be hard when you're working remotely with teams, but if you can try to listen with all your senses, so you're listening for tone of voice, you're looking at people's faces as much as you can, you're looking out for patterns or phrases that are being used that could be valuable. Stay curious. That's the big message from listening. And what you're hearing will help you shape questions that will in turn help you find out more information. We don't have all the answers. I said this before, but if you're looking outwards and staying actively curious, you will get all sorts of insights that you hadn't considered, I'm pretty sure. Now, the listening piece is also relevant for yourself. So how can you listen more to what's going on for you? So that chatter piece that we talked about earlier, and how can you cultivate greater self-awareness? We're getting towards the end of the session, and I'm going to touch on a really important point for me, which is around social connection. And I think we've all learned the importance of social connection over the last few years. And there's an increasing amount of research around this, and anything that you read around wellbeing and resilience will undoubtedly talk about social connection, being with others. And one thing I was reading in the last couple of weeks around resilience is that resilience is a team sport. So connection and community with others is key. So we're social animals. That's how we're built as human beings. We have a human need for connection, community, being part of something bigger. We want to care about others. We want to matter. So, and sometimes if we feel that we're in our heads too much and that chatter is going up, opening up and connecting with others can be really valuable. Getting curious, as I said earlier. And this is where I see psychological safety come in too, inside organizations and for leaders too. But it's not just about making it okay for your team to talk to you in a way that they can raise concerns or ask questions or talk about mistakes without negative consequences. But it's also about your own psychological safety as a leader and in your own leadership group and amongst your peers. So how can you develop that? And is it a topic that you need to talk about? Do you have that? So that's a really important point for me. And then I'm just going to finish on that topic about compassion and kindness. So helping us contribute to other people's well-being and not expecting anything in return. So around kindness. And compassion is really about feeling a need to reach out for somebody and take actions that will alleviate someone else's distress. And self-compassion is equally important. So not being so hard on ourselves sometimes when we don't get things right or we make a mistake. And self-compassion is really important when we're talking about self-talk and chatter too. So one exercise I'll leave you with that one is if you're saying something in your head that you think, should I be saying this to myself? Would I say this out loud to my best friend? If I wouldn't, why am I saying it to myself? So before we finish, I'm just going to wrap up. In summary, I just say that we're all facing the same tsunami of challenges at the moment, more than I think we have been previously, whether that's tech revolutions, climate change, fear about AI, cost of living, finance concerns, the list goes on. But putting our heads down and trying to keep going, which is another thing that resilience isn't, by the way, as we've probably all done before, isn't going to get us the results that we want and to deliver change in a healthy and sustainable way. And I'm certain that organisations that focus on the bottom line and don't think about their place in the whole ecosystem that we work in, the environment we're all operating in and the people within them and the impact they have, they won't attract the right talent and keep them for the long term. I'm pretty convinced of that. So what I'd like to do is suggest a slightly different approach in the time of uncertainty that we're in. And that's for leaders. And going back to that COVID piece that I talked about earlier. So leaders and managers, I believe, have the ability to be a really positive influence in their organization. They can be great role models and around the behaviors for well-being and resilience. They can really promote positive well-being and resilience in their teams. But that starts with leaders themselves. So it might be around how you cultivate your own sense of psychological safety, how you feel that you belong in your organization, or how you can look after your own personal resilience and develop tools for that. When we get into that space, it's good for you as a leader, it's good for your people and your teams, and it's good for your organization, and it makes a difference. Change, uncertainty, crisis, they're not going to go away anytime soon. So we do need to cultivate resilience and be prepared to constantly test and learn and ask for help where it makes sense. So before we finish, again, last point for reflection is what one thing you want to take away from today. It's not necessarily a thing to do. It might be a thing to think about. And you can share that with somebody at home or at work, or maybe just take a note of it yourself. So with that, I'd like to say thank you all and open up for questions.
Hi, Joe. Thank you very much for the discussion or presentation. Of course, discussion is an offer we make to the audience, and depending on their comments, they may post something. Maybe I ask the first question, right? And I mean, there's a lot about artificial intelligence going on right now, and I'm sure you know how this will affect the work and the way we work, and what leaders and maybe team leaders can do to maybe maintain a human-centric approach, while still probably trying to leverage technology and look into efficiency and even decision making. While employees may feel like maybe some of these decisions that AI comes up with are not maybe the right ones. Who knows?
Yeah, there's so much to consider about that right at the moment. It's what's your perspective on it, Christopher?
I think like with any things like change, embrace it, right? I think we should look at the positive sides of it, right? And leverage it also for ourselves, right? And look into it, like you said, like be open, to sort of and continue learning, right?
Yes.
And see, how we may embrace that. But still, I assume there's a lot of probably fear around lots of jobs and job profiles, and that may even create new jobs, right? But still,
yeah, I think that's really really interesting from a mindset perspective as well, in terms of how we can approach things with a more a less fixed mindset. So how can we look at things from a different perspective and really have a growth mindset around it? So what's the learning? The fear can kick in at the beginning, but it's then how do we respond to that? Over the last few months, with the conversation since November last year around ChatGPT, I've had lots of conversations with copywriters, for example, who fear that their world is going to turn upside down. So it's how can you see those upsides and have that hope and optimism element of learning really about what that might look like and be different. It's going to be a fascinating ride, I think, for the next few months.
Thank you.
Curious how effective this can be in avoiding misidentification of fault lines in the workplace. That's an interesting question, Nika. Is it Nika or Nika? The intersection of influence. I'm not sure if I completely understand this, so apologies. So what I use this for is in the way that I talked about it previously. So it's understanding where I might have influence or my team might have influence. And that can be either with or without authority. But it's the process of identifying those in the first place, which is really key. So taking those concerns and making sense of them in terms of whether they're concerns that stay out or whether they're overwhelming concerns or whether we can bring them into that influence level. The curiosity piece is a very good point, how it can help avoid misidentification of fault lines is, and it would be a really interesting activity to do really in terms of hierarchies as well and how those might overlap or even create or where you can spot gaps where things are not being addressed or where people assume that they don't have influence or control. So it's a really good question, thank you. And I don't think I've answered it, but I'd be really interesting to carry on the conversation if you'd be interested in doing that. Could we have a copy of the slides? I'm happy for the slides to be shared, but that is kind of up to the Change Institute as well.
We can make that happen.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Pia, what would be the first thing you should do when you're experiencing change fatigue and seeing it in your team as well? What a wonderful question. This is a great question. So when you are experiencing change fatigue, one of the questions is, how do you know that you have change fatigue? What does that look like? How is it showing up? So that goes back to the self-awareness piece that we talked about quite early on, is understanding what that looks like for you. So I think the first thing that I would do is recognize that I'm actually in that situation and what that looks like for me. So if I experience change fatigue, which I've had previously in my career, I tend not to sleep so well. My eating habits become slightly unhealthy and my exercise gets deprioritized and work starts to come up. So I think it's recognizing, it's a really good question, Pia, recognizing what it is for you, and then also having an open conversation in your team about what that might look like for them. People may not even recognize what change fatigue is. So if you can have a conversation about it and explain it, it might help people to put that into context. With everything else that we've got going on at the moment, it can be tricky to understand where change fatigue is kicking in. I hope that answers your question. Great. Psych safety, good piece, listening pace, listening. Yes. Looking at what's happening within. Yes. Always. If we can do that and cultivate a habit of doing that, it is so valuable, of recognizing how we're responding rather than reacting to situations. So listening to ourselves, being vigilant and aware of my bucket. I love that. Thank you so much. The bucket analogy has been so valuable for me over the last few years since I learned about it. The stress container has been really helpful.
Yep. Getting maybe getting a hole into the bucket so everything will
yes
just go away.
There's another interesting one, which I was in conversation with someone yesterday around having our bucket and making sure that it's not overloaded with stress, but also making sure, and many of the people on here will have heard the put your oxygen mask on first before you try to help other people. And we can use that in a positive way with our containers as well. So if you think about having a cup that is overflowing with positivity, that's another container that you can think about as well. But I don't want to overload people with oxygen masks, buckets and containers, but they're useful visualizations that I find helpful.
Thank you. I think we've reached the time anyway, so I guess everyone is going somewhere and running somewhere. So Joe, thank you very much for joining us today for this session, which was very interesting. I hope everybody could take something away for their personal and professional life from that session. So thank you so much, Joe, for spending time with us today.
You. And thanks everyone for some really interesting questions too.
Yeah, and well, for me, it's to close maybe with some next dates potentially you're interested in. There's another webinar that the Change Institute will organize on leadership in our Barney work with Tomasz Jirska, who's another faculty member in our program. And then the ones that are into mergers and acquisitions, like Joe mentioned, that triggered a little bit of the stress and interest into the change field, if I understood that correctly. We do have some on-site trainings about mergers and acquisitions or post-merger integration in Singapore and Vienna come up, as well virtually live for those who cannot travel or cannot attend, as well as I don't imagine, but maybe people who are interested in doing valuations. We have Professor Damodaran from NYU give trainings with the Institute for Mergers, Acquisitions and Alliances. Maybe you or some colleagues would want to join. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you all again with the next webinar. And let us know if we can do something for you. Reach out to us, and we're happy to share any of the slides and other materials. And Joe, contact details in the slides as well. Thank you so much, and have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you.